Well, good evening. I want to welcome you to Park Community Church. My name is Dan Osborne, and I have the privilege of serving on staff at our Lincoln Park campus. I want to make a special shout out to those of you guys who are joining us via the live stream tonight. Thank you for being with here. We are excited to partner with the Chicago Festival of Thought. And now, if you came on the arm of a friend, or you're not really sure what the Festival of Thought is, here's a quick synopsis of what's going on this week in our city. All throughout the Loop and some of the surrounding college campuses, the Festival of Thought is a series of lectures and talks handling profound worldview questions. Questions about origins, about meaning, about morality, and even about destiny. And so tonight, we have the privilege of being joined by author and speaker Amy Orr-Ewing. And here's a bit of a background about who she is and why she's going to be talking with us tonight. Amy's gotten a first-class degree from Christ Church, Oxford University, before going on to get her master's in theology from King's College in London. Right? She's currently working on her doctoral thesis at Oxford. Amy is a renowned speaker, speaking all over the world on university campuses and in government buildings. She's been invited to speak at the White House. She's been up on Capitol Hill in something called the Speaker's Room in Parliament. It's an American, I don't know what that is, but it sounds really important in context. So she's a great speaker, and she is a prolific author, writing 2 books recently connected to tonight's topic. One called Why Trust the Bible, and the other, But Is It Real? And so we are grateful to have her with us here tonight. Would you join me in welcoming Amy Orr-Ewing?
Well, thanks for that welcome, and welcome if you're watching on the live stream as well. So tonight we're going to be looking at this question, can we really trust the Bible? Why trust the Bible? It's a really important question, I hope you'll agree. And we're looking forward as well, not just to me talking, but to hearing questions from you guys. So you've got some cards on your chairs. If questions occur to you as I'm speaking, do write them down, because we're going to be taking your questions after I've spoken. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, one of the major reasons why I think this question is so important is because of the staggering influence that the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, still exerts today, even 2,000 years after he was on earth. My colleague at the Oxford Centre, Tom Price, became a Christian while he was studying philosophy as an undergraduate at university. And he said this about Jesus. He said, "One person in 60 billion who stands out deserves a second look." H.G. Wells called Jesus the most dominant person in human history. Jesus never wrote a book. And yet, more books have been written about him than about anyone or about anything else. Jesus had no formal education, and yet thousands of universities and schools and colleges have been founded in his name. The historian Philip Schaff put it like this, describing the overwhelming influence of Jesus. He said, "This Jesus of Nazareth, without money and arms, conquered more millions than Alexander, Caesar, Muhammad, and Napoleon. Without science, he shed more light on things human and divine than all philosophers and scholars combined. Without the eloquence of schools, he spoke such words of life as were never spoken before or since. And he produced effects which lie beyond the reach of orator or poet. Without writing a single line, he has set more pens in motion and furnished themes for more sermons, orations, discussions, learned volumes, works of art, and songs of praise than the whole army of great men of ancient modern times." Now, the book, which contains eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and death, is also incredibly successful just on literary terms. It's actually the most successful literary creation ever produced. It's been more influential than Shakespeare, And it's completely international. Homer's Iliad has been translated into 40 languages, Shakespeare into 60, but the Bible into well over 2,000. That's 10 times more than any other book. And the Bible is every publisher's dream. It outsells every book every year. It's the world's bestseller, 44 million copies of the Bible selling every year. So tonight we're going to consider this question of whether this book that has been astonishingly successful at influencing culture, and it still sells and is obviously interesting to people, but we're going to consider the question of whether it can be really justified, that influence, whether the Bible can be really trusted. In my own family, my father was born in East Germany, and my grandfather was an atomic scientist. After the Russian occupation of where they lived, my grandfather made contact with the British, and a small plane was sent to rescue the family and bring them out. And my grandfather began working as a scientist for the British government. As a committed atheist, my grandfather forbade his family from ever reading the Bible or talking about God. There was no Bible and no God talk in the house. The family that I come from was not predisposed to believe in the Bible or to be religious. It was only when my father himself, an academic and an adult well into his 30s, when he encountered evidence for the Christian faith, and in particular the Bible, that this book even came onto the horizon of our family. And I'm so glad that that happened. And I wonder whether there are people here tonight or watching on the live stream tonight for whom they're equally not necessarily predisposed to be religious, but are open to the possibility that there might be something trustworthy, there might be something worth looking at here. So tonight we're going to ask a number of questions about the Bible. Firstly, very briefly, what is it? Secondly, can we really trust what it actually says? And thirdly, what about the miracles? Don't the miracles in this book lead us to think, well, it's just fairy tales, it's just fantasy, you'd have to be a lunatic to really take it seriously. So firstly, what is the Bible made of? Well, I'm sure lots of you know the Bible isn't just one book written by one person. It's a collection of 66 divided into two sections. 39 in the largest part, the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. And the Bible is written over a period of 1,600 years by more than 40 authors. And these are people from all kinds of different backgrounds. We have kings writing, diplomats, but also poorer people, someone like Amos. He was the dresser of sycamore fig trees, the dirtiest job in his society, fisherman and a tent maker. The Bible is written in three languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and it was written on three continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. Now, often people imagine the Bible is the kind of tool of the white man, which has been used to found empires and beat people into submission in a sort of patriarchal conspiracy. And obviously, when we look at world history, we can see that terrible things have been done in the name of religion. But when we look at the Bible and the origins of the Bible, that preconception of this book doesn't actually fit the facts. You see, the vast spread of the Bible's original social, geographical, and cultural context is then also multiplied immediately as the New Testament in particular was translated into multiple languages in the first century, copied and spread throughout the known world. And that means that the ancient texts upon which the translations of the Bible that you might have picked up are based is both extremely well attested, but has also come out of multiple cultures and languages. Now, when we ask questions about the integrity of any ancient writing, it's determined by a number of things. One of those things would be the number of documented manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts that we have to examine, just how many of this thing has survived. And then we might ask a question about the time difference between when the original was written and when a surviving piece of it still exists. What's the time difference between those two things? Now, if we were to take other ancient literature, we might take Plato, for example. and study his writings. The oldest copy of those manuscripts of Plato is a copy dating from about 1400 years after it was originally written. If we were to look at Sophocles, we might say, well, there are 193 copies, ancient copies of this manuscript, but the earliest is also 1400 years after Sophocles was writing. Or we might look at Aristophanes. 10 copies survive, but there's a time difference of 1,200 years between when it was written and what survives. And yet these texts are respected, and they're read in the present day. When it comes to the New Testament, we're not talking about 10 or 193 surviving manuscripts. We're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands, upwards of 30,000. And the originals aren't separated from the manuscripts by 1,400 years, but from the earliest ones that survive, mere decades. Now, what's the Bible originally written on? Well, during the early Christian era, there were two types of writing material most commonly used was papyrus. That was a highly durable reed from the Nile Valley, and it was glued together, much like plywood is today, and then laid out in the sun to dry. And lots of the finds of the New Testament, earlier finds that have been discovered in the 20th and 21st centuries, are on papyrus, discovered in the dry and arid lands of North Africa and the Middle East. And they can often be quite small pieces, perhaps pieces that have broken off a longer piece. Another material that was used is called parchment. That was made from the skin of sheep or goats, and it was in wide use until the Middle Ages when paper took over. And parchment was much more expensive, so documents that were considered to be of great importance were written on parchment. Many of the slightly later 2nd and 3rd century finds, and maybe longer pieces of the New Testament, are on parchment. Now, when we come to look at the textual attestation of the New Testament, the thousands of manuscripts that exist today, the small time difference between what survives and when it was written, what we see is the attestation of the text itself is unparalleled with any other ancient writing, both in terms of that time difference and the surviving number of witnesses to the text. But when it comes to the Bible, I think that probably isn't enough to persuade most of us that it's trustworthy, or that we should perhaps listen to what it says, or it has any relevance to our lives today. Just because we might be able to trust the preservation of what was originally written down to today, doesn't mean that we can necessarily believe what they wrote down. Is it true, or is it just a fairy story, even if what's been preserved is in reality what was originally written? Well, the Gospels in particular claim to be based on eyewitness testimony. And that is a claim that today can be rigorously tested. And I want us to spend a few moments thinking about it. When it comes to the Gospels, there are a few key questions that we can ask. And one of my friends, Pete Williams, based at Cambridge, has helped develop some of these questions in helping to establish whether this is legend, whether this is fairy story, or whether this is actually history. And the first question is this: where were the Gospels written? Well, according to tradition, the 4 Gospels were not all written in the land of the origin of the stories they tell. Israel, Judea. You see, Mark was written in Rome. Luke was written in Antioch, or possibly Rome. John's Gospel was written in Ephesus, in Turkey. And Matthew's Gospel probably was written in Judea. Now, a skeptical person might say, okay, the Gospels predominantly are written outside of the land of the stories that they purport to tell. Why should we trust what they say? They don't have any real, genuine connection with the history, with the events. And this is precisely what Bart Ehrman, one of the leading kind of skeptics today, writes. He says, where did these anonymous Greek-speaking authors living probably outside of Palestine some 35 to 65 years after the events that they narrate get their information? Where did they get their information? Well, if the gospel writers were doing their work of writing outside of the land, there's agreement between traditional and critical scholars about this. That means we can ask questions, important questions, about how familiar the writers were with the land that they're talking about. Do they know the geography, the agriculture, the botany, the architecture, the traditions, the burial practices, the economics, the personal names, the culture, if you like, of the place they describe? If you've never visited a place, it's really hard to get those kinds of details right. And what it means is that we today can look back and we can ask questions. Did the authors writing thousands of miles away know those kinds of details? Did they get them right? So the next question then we're going to think about is, after where were they written, is do the writers call the characters the right thing? When we examine the time of Jesus, a study has been done of 3,000 names that people were called back then. Using archaeology, using inscriptions, and an exhaustive study of the area, Jewish names in Palestine were collated. It all began with an academic based in Germany who made a list of these names, and the research is called the Tal-Elam Lexicon of Jewish Names in Late Antiquity, Part 1. Not the most gripping read, you might think. But actually, it's fascinating because a scholar called Richard Borkham picked up that piece of research and he thought, wow, we have an exhaustive study of the surviving references to people's names. We can apply that study and look at the New Testament and see whether those gospel writers actually called people the right thing. Is there a tie-up between what people were actually called and between what the Gospels say they were called in that particular time frame? So if we were to take male Jewish names in Judea in the 1st century, this would be the order of popularity according to the academic study. Number 1, Simon, 2, Joseph, 3, Lazarus, 4, Judas, 5, John, 6, Jesus, 7, Ananias. And so it goes on. Now, if you were to take the 9 top Jewish male Palestinian names together, outside of the New Testament, they're 41% of name usage. Inside the New Testament, they're 40%. This is a pattern that shows up over 4 writers writing 5 books. We include the Acts of the Apostles as well, the 4 Gospels, and then the Acts, which Luke wrote. And the Gospels reflect this pattern together and individually. Now, it became even more interesting when a study was done of Jewish male names, not in Palestine in the 1st century, but in Egypt, a few miles away. In Greco-Roman Egypt, there was a Jewish community living there in the 1st century. And the list of names there, let's read the 7 names, the most popular names. Number 1, Eleazar. Number 2, Sabbateus. Number 3, Joseph. Number 4, Dositheus. 5, Pappus. 6, Ptolemaeus. 7, Samuel. Now, names like Sabbateus, Dositheus, and Pappus are in the top 10 Jewish male names in Egypt in the 1st century, but they're not in the Gospels and they don't sound familiar to us. Why not? Because the Gospels were not written about Jewish people living in Egypt, a few miles away. They were written about Jewish people living in Palestine, Judea, Palestine, in the 1st century. Now, I wonder if I were to ask you today, do you know how names differ in Egypt from Jordan and Syria today? I suggest you might struggle. If I were to ask you to rank the top 10 male baby names in Britain in 1970, you might struggle. I would struggle. I would certainly struggle to do it in America. But the gospel writers get the right proportions and the right statistical proportion of name usage. They get the right proportion of name, but they also get the right features of names. Imagine if you were a first century mother. Now, I have 3 boys. I have 3 lovely, lovely boys. And I can tell you that one thing that never, ever happens is that when I open the back door and I call out in my garden, or you call it a yard, sorry, call out in my yard, supper's ready, boys, come in, come and eat your food. One thing that never happens is that they immediately come. Let's imagine, though, that in the first century, a first century mother in a Jewish context in Palestine were to open her door and call for her son, Simon. And people actually came in that fictitious world. What would happen? She'd call out Simon. In that first century Jewish context, it was the most popular male name. There would have been lots of Simons, so Simons would come running from everywhere. So that mother would need to distinguish which Simon she was talking about. Now, what's fascinating is that the gospel writers know when to distinguish between a name and when not to bother doing it. And when that name Simon occurs, you see that it's a distinguished name in the text. Jesus had 2 Simon disciples. One was called Simon Cephas and the other Simon the Zealot. He had dinner with a guy called Simon the leper. Another guy called Simon of Cyrene carried the cross. Simon Peter stayed in the book of Acts with another guy called Simon the tanner. Now, it's really easy when you're writing a story or even watching a film to get the kind of plot line of what you're seeing, but to forget names, to get those details wrong. And yet when we study the New Testament, what we see is that the writers get the names right. And that suggests that we're not getting something 5th, 6th, 7th hand. We're getting something carefully preserved. The only way you get that kind of detail preserved in that kind of statistically testable way is if you're dealing with high quality eyewitness testimony. We could take a text like Matthew's Gospel, chapter 10, where there's a list of disciples, and this is illustrated brilliantly. Richard Borkham brings this out in his study. As the list of disciples just listed off, so we know who those 12 guys were. Simon, it says, was called Peter, and Andrew his brother. Now remember, Simon is the most popular name on this list. So he's number 1, so he's going to need to be distinguished. James comes next. He's number 11 on the list. A high-ranking name. He's the son of Zebedee, so he gets distinguished. John, he's number 5 on the list. Again, a high-ranking name. That's his brother. But Philip, he's only number 61 on the list of most popular names. He's just Philip. There's no identifier after him. Bartholomew, he's only number 50 on that list. Low ranking on the list, no qualification of which Bartholomew. Thomas, he doesn't even make it into the top 100. Really unpopular name. No qualifier after his name. Matthew comes next. He's number 9. He was the tax collector. Then comes James again, number 11. High-ranking name on the list. He's the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, only number 39. Low ranking. No distinguishing feature, just straight old Thaddeus. Simon again, number 1. He's the Canaanian. And Judas, number 4. High-ranking name, therefore he gets distinguished. He's Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed Jesus. Now, these statistics have only been known by academics since 2003, when this slightly random study of a list of names was published. And yet there's this extraordinary correlation Between the list of ancient names and the statistics of gospel writers' usage of names and qualifiers of popular names, only recently known, but it shows us beyond a shadow of a doubt that these texts come, the message within these texts come from first century Palestine. These documents, which name people so accurately, were formed by people who had an intimate knowledge of the events and the land that they describe. They'd been made up by people far away. They wouldn't have been able to get this kind of information right. The lists of names and the usage of names in the Gospels has the right pattern for the time and the place, but it's not just true of lists, and it's not just true of name usage, it's also true of dialogue. And I find this one really interesting. Now, you know, as I said earlier, John, the name John, was number 5 on the list of popularity. And so in that famous incident when Herod wants to say of Jesus that he's John the Baptist come from the dead, he can't simply say he's John come from the dead, because there would have been thousands of Johns. Herod had to distinguish which John he was talking about, and that happens in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 1 to 2. Now, after that, the narrator, writing down about the incident, can keep on referring to John. We've already established which John we're talking about. But later on, Herodias' daughter dances. You may remember the story. And it used to, when I was a child, it was my favourite page in the children's Bible. I immediately turned to it every night. Apparently, it was my favourite book, and opened it to a very gory picture of a platter with a chopped off head on it. You remember when she dances and she gets this head on a platter? So in John's Gospel, chapter 14, having already established which John we're talking about, and the narrator dropping the Baptist qualifier, when the dialogue kicks in and speech is reported of Herodias' daughter, she specifies, I want the head of John the Baptist. She doesn't want any old John's head. She wants John the Baptist's head. The dialogue specifies when necessary which John is being talked about. This is an indicator that direct speech has been accurately captured and passed down. This is exactly the way people would have spoken, even though the narrator had already been able to drop that epitaph. Another question we might be able to ask is the question of geography. Do the authors know the place that they are describing? Now, my knowledge of Chicago is pretty limited, even though I've been here at least 5 times. I've driven a car here twice, and I've watched quite a few TV shows set here. I've also transited through the airport on more than 17 occasions. So I know Chicago really well, right? I know your city inside out like the back of my hand. Well, we'd be wrong. And I have access to the internet. If the gospel writers had not lived and ministered in Palestine, could their knowledge of the place have been what it is in the Gospels? Remember, if they're writing from a long way away, recording events, would they have known the landscape in the way that they did? Now, when we read the Gospels, the most commonly mentioned place is Jerusalem. There are 66 references to it. It's the capital city. The next is Nazareth. There are 21 references to it. It's the place that Jesus grew up. Then Capernaum, that's mentioned 16 places. That's a pretty significant place that you might have heard of, even if you'd never been there. But on top of those places like Bethany, Bethlehem, Bethsaida, Jericho, Sidon, Tyre, Aenon, Arimathea, Bethpage, Caesarea Philippi, Cana, and so on. These names of really quite tiny places are mentioned. Here's the question. How would someone writing in Syria, Egypt, Greece, or Turkey, or Italy, how would that person know those names. Even a map from Rome would have included those tiny villages. Now, the four Gospels mention between 12 and 14 towns each and a total of 23 places. But if we compare the biblical Gospels with later so-called Gospels, Gospels that were written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, we can compare what that kind of writing was actually like. We could take the Gospel of Philip. That mentions two places, Jerusalem, the capital city, and Nazareth. But it mentions Nazareth as if it was Jesus' middle name. It doesn't know it's a place. The Gospel of Peter mentions one town, Jerusalem. And the other 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century Gospels don't mention any specific places at all. That's what happens when accounts are passed on and then details drop out over centuries. That's what happens when people do write down stories that are more vague, not rooted in history. But that is not what happened with the four Gospels. So I want to ask you a question tonight. What if the four Gospels told things as they actually happened? They mention these place names naturally, not in a way that is intrusive. It's about real time and real place. It's about real people interacting with one another. And in a rigorous and verifiable way, we can check whether they get details right. These statistics have, as I said earlier, only been known by academics relatively recently. But I think they demonstrate, they show us really good evidence to believe that what's contained in the Bible isn't fairy stories. It's not sort of random legends layered over mythology. It's rigorously recorded history. The New Testament itself contains this compelling evidence that it is eyewitness testimony. And both the record of the manuscript tradition and the content of what has been recorded both lend themselves, I suggest, the rational person concluding that the New Testament can be trusted. And if it can be trusted, its message is of the utmost importance. In many parts of the world today, people will go a very long way, even give their lives to be able to read a Bible. And yet in the West, we often take it totally for granted and perhaps make all kinds of assumptions about what it is. A few years ago now, I was part of a small team of student journalists. We were theological students studying at Oxford. And we'd heard about this crazy group called the Taliban who has taken over Afghanistan. And we wanted to find out a bit more about their theology so that we could write papers on their theology. And we got visas to go and visit them and talk to them. And we found ourselves in their military headquarters, meeting the education minister, the foreign minister, and the religion minister. And in that context, we'd also taken Bibles in because we hoped to be able to give them Bibles as well as ask them about their religious views. And as we handed the Bibles over, they were all heavily armed with Kalashnikovs. As we handed the Bibles over, we weren't really sure whether it was such a good idea. But when the religion minister took hold of the Bible, he was astonished. He said, "Thank you for this. I've been praying to God for years that I could read the Bible." But he never had the opportunity to read it. What about you? Where do you stand tonight? If both the manuscript tradition and the New Testament itself contain compelling evidence that this is literature that doesn't need to be taken lightly, that can be verified, that can be scrutinized, perhaps it might be worth, like that religion minister, picking it up and reading it for yourself. Third question, briefly. Well, okay, you may be able to say, well, okay, the records of the Bible, they've been preserved by this manuscript tradition, and okay, some of the details of the text have been carefully recorded, but that surely doesn't mean that we should believe the miracles that are contained in there. This is a widespread reason for rejecting the Gospels, rejecting the Bible and believing it to be fairy stories, because it contains a recording of powerful, miraculous events. Now, one reason for rejecting just out of course anything miraculous is assuming a framework, a logical framework within which miracles or anything supernatural are an impossibility. It was David Hume who famously wrote about this kind of skepticism. He argued that all objects of human inquiry must either be relations of ideas, they must be mathematically or analytically verifiable, or they need to be matters of fact. They need to be empirically testable. In other words, you've got to be able to get your test tube out and test that this thing is true. And if that's our worldview, we're going to read the Bible and we're going to say, well, there are miracles. I just reject it immediately. These are logical impossibilities. But of course, there's a problem with Hume's philosophy, and that's that it fails its own test. Since the philosophy itself, the idea itself, fits into neither category. It's neither analytically verifiable, it's not provable mathematically, nor is it empirically verifiable. We can't repeatedly test it in a scientific laboratory. So perhaps we need to at least be open to the possibility of a miracle. If we are committed to the impossibility of the supernatural, I want to challenge that assumption tonight and say, are you open to that assumption being challenged? C.S. Lewis pointed out with regard to miracles, he said this: if on each of 2 nights I put £10 in my bedside drawer, I should change it to $10 to be contextually relevant here. If I put $10 in my bedside drawer, the laws of arithmetic tell me that I now have a total of £20. If, however, on waking up, I find only £5 in the drawer, I don't conclude that the laws of arithmetic have been broken, but possibly the laws of England. John Lennox puts it like this. He said, the laws of nature describe to us the regularities on which the universe normally runs, but God, who created the universe with those laws, is no more their prisoner than the thief is a prisoner of the laws of arithmetic. Like my room, the universe is not a closed system. God can, if he wills, do something special. Do some kind of miracle, like raise Jesus from the dead. And what's really important here is, I think, to say that Christians aren't saying that miracles are happening naturally. We're saying, and the Bible is saying, that this is an intervention by God from outside. And actually, it's only possible to recognize that kind of intervention if we know the scientific laws upon which the universe runs. It's the laws of arithmetic, the laws of maths that warn me that I've been robbed. And in the same way, if we didn't know that dead people usually stay in their tombs, we wouldn't be able to recognize the resurrection of Jesus as a miracle. The laws of nature can't rule out the possibility of a miracle. And when you do investigate a biblical miracle claim, like the resurrection of Jesus, you may be surprised by what you discover. Professor Richard Swinburne was recently lecturing at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, where I work, and he was for years a philosophy professor at the University of Oxford, a brilliant man. And he demonstrated in his research that the resurrection of Jesus is strongly supported by probability theory. Swinburne took the probability formula known as Bayes' theorem, and he applied it to the resurrection of Jesus. And he concluded that the probability of the resurrection of Christ having actually occurred is 97%. Now, you may not agree with that, but that, I think, is a stunning statistic for anyone who wants to just throw away the Bible out of hand because a miracle has occurred. N.T. Wright writes this. He says, no other explanations have been offered in 2,000 years of sneering skepticism against the Christian witness that can satisfactorily account for how the tomb came to be empty, how the disciples came to see Jesus, and how their lives and worldviews were transformed. He writes, I think it perfectly reasonable to deduce from the evidence that a miracle occurred in history and that Jesus was raised from the dead. It may also be interesting, if you're skeptical about miracles, to look at the context of New Testament miracles. Many of the men and women involved were fishermen and tax collectors, down-to-earth types. I don't know how many people you know who work for the IRS who are given to flights of fancy. But in my country, tax collectors tend to have their feet on the ground. They are the people who recorded these miracles. When we read in a gospel that Jesus walked on water, the narrative doesn't assume we're in a religious legend type book now. So don't worry about it, just accept he walked on water. No. The narrative tells us that when that was seen, people were terrified. The reaction to the miracle rings true. The reader is being told of these things with an acknowledgement that this is unusual. We're expected to be surprised. We read that when Joseph discovered that Mary was pregnant, he wanted to split up with her. A genuine reaction. He understood how the birds and the bees work. And when he heard she was pregnant, he knew he hadn't slept with her, and he assumed a natural reason for the pregnancy. He didn't think, oh, great, we're in the Bible, it's in a legend, it's fine. It must have been God. It was only when an angel appeared to him with supernatural experience that he had himself that he was convinced otherwise. For someone who's skeptical about the possibility of the miraculous, it may be important to pick up and read a gospel for yourself. But what if what they claimed happened is actually true? It would make a massive difference to everything. See, the Christian claim is that God has made himself known to us in real time, space, and history. And he's done it for a purpose. He's made himself known so that we can come to know him personally, not just know about him, not just think thoughts about him, but actually meet him, to be forgiven by him, and to spend eternity with him. The miracles of the Bible are not about some legend, delusional fantasy world. They reflect the divine breaking into the real world that we all know. The world of pain, the world of disappointment, the world of violation, the world of dysfunction. We're not reading about a God who's distant, who orders us around arbitrarily, but a God who is willing to identify with us to such an extent that he will take the consequences of our darkness, our disobedience, the violations of other people's freedom that we have perpetrated, the violations of relationships that we've perpetrated against others and with him. He's willing to take that upon himself so that we can come to know him. It was the writer Solzhenitsyn who was a brilliant observer of the human condition, imprisoned by Stalin for writing poetry, who himself became a Christian through the experience of watching Christians in the Gulag in Siberia and how they dealt with the beatings and the death that they faced. And he wrote this. He said, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But he said, the line dividing good and evil cuts not through nations, political classes, different types of people, but through every human being. The Bible recognizes and is resonant with the reality that we all know. God enters the real world that we all experience. And Jesus on the cross dies for us, suffering with us and for us, offering his life for ours, making a way for us to know God. So in conclusion, the Bible has been vital in shaping civilization, challenging vested interests. In my own country, Wilberforce was inspired by the Bible to campaign for the abolition of slavery. The Bible inspired the Jubilee campaign, which was later rebranded Make Poverty History. Some of you might have been part of that. And that culminated in the cancelling of massive amounts of third world debt on the part of Western governments. Gordon Brown, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain in December 2000, on making a speech about cancelling billions of pounds of third world debt from 41 countries owed to Britain, got up and gave a speech. And where did he go for the inspiration for his speech? He went to Isaiah chapter 60. And he spoke of what that prophet spoke of releasing the captives. When Martin Luther King made his famous I Have a Dream speech as part of the civil rights movement here, where did he turn? He quoted vociferously from the Bible. The Bible speaks to our human condition, that we've been created with purpose, but it diagnoses the condition of the broken world. It tells us, though, of a God who loves us and has entered history in Christ so that we can have relationship with him, that our darkness and brokenness is borne by him, that we're offered forgiveness and new life. More than shaping societies, this is for us as individuals. This is for you and I to be offered real relationship with the God who knows us. What will you do with that offer? We have time for questions coming now. But I'd like us to just take a moment as we reflect on some of the things we talked about. And it may be that there are some people here who would like to respond to God personally. And if that's not you, there's absolutely no pressure on you whatsoever. So just be thinking about your question right now, the question you'd like to ask from what you've heard. But let's give space, just a moment, to those who would like to take a step in response to that extravagant offer of God, his love for us in Jesus. And you've all got a card on your seat, so pick it up and you may want to start writing a question or any other feedback on this card, and we're going to collect them in a moment. But I'm going to pray a simple prayer. And in that prayer, I'm just going to say three quite polite things, really. I am English, I know you're not, but sorry, thank you, and please. It's a great way to begin a relationship. Sorry for the brokenness, sorry for the separation that there's been between us. Thank you to God for coming in history in the person of Jesus, and please come into my life. I'd like to begin a relationship with you. So let's just close our eyes for a moment. And if you'd like to pray, just echo the prayer in your heart. And if you don't want to, just think about what question you'd like to ask in a minute. So God, I'm sorry for the brokenness, the darkness in my life, my part in the violation of this world. Thank you, Jesus, for coming in history in a way that we can know and see. Thank you for dying on the cross. Please come into my life now. I want to accept that offer of relationship with you. Amen. Okay, well, we have a moment now, and we're going to start collecting the questions in. But if you could take the card that's on your seat, it looks like this, and there's a pen, I think, in the pocket in front of the seat in front of you. We'd love you to write your questions on this card, and we're going to collect them in and try and get through as many questions as we can. But if you pray to God for the first time or the first time in a long time, and that meant something to you tonight, we'd love you to just tick that box, count me in. If you're not in that place at all, but you're interested by what you've heard and you'd like to find out more, we have that little box, tell me more. We'd love you to tick that box and give your details, and we can let you know about further events. But either way, we really want to support you on your spiritual journey. And we're going to take a few moments now to write questions on those cards. If everyone could do that, it would be really helpful, because then we can get a straw poll of what questions are most popular. And we're going to be coming round to collect them now. I'm going to invite my colleague Christian Hofreiter to come up as well and join me on the stage to answer some questions. I think we've got one that's come in early, maybe two, that we're going to start with as you're writing them. And do hand them to the girls who are standing here, and they're going to come along the rows and collect them from you. Christian is a brilliant theologian. His doctorate was from the University of Oxford, looking at the texts about war in the Old Testament. Isn't that right?
That's right.
And Christian, why don't you introduce yourself a bit? You're based in Austria, aren't you?
That's right. I'm a colleague of Amy's. Lived for 7 years in Oxford, where I did my doctorate, and worked in research groups, also with scientists from the natural sciences, human sciences, philosophy. And today I get to travel the world and just engage in conversations. I did actually today at Rush University with medical students, medical professionals, about the question of suffering, and lots of questions that people have about the Christian faith. Is it credible? Can it withstand scrutiny? How does it align with the sciences? What we're finding out in all these different endeavors. And I love the engagement, especially because I find that the answers we can give as Christians are so strong and persuasive, not only for the heart, very much for the heart, but also for the mind. So it's a great joy to do that. And so to join you here and all of you here in Chicago this evening.
Thank you.
First of all, Amy, thank you. Thank you for being here. Would you guys join me in thanking Amy for speaking tonight? Thank you for that. While you guys are writing down some questions, we did have two that came in early. Just would love you to speak to some of these. One I hear a lot is, with the way that the Bible came together, how did that happen? Was it more of, just a bunch of people getting together and deciding which books we're going to be in? And some of us have heard things about like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas. I know you mentioned those a little bit, but why don't we have those books in the Bible today?
Thank you. That's a brilliant question. So at the beginning, I sort of touched on the sense, the reality that pretty much as soon as the New Testament had been written in the first century, it was translated rapidly into multiple languages and spread across the known world as the early church kind of moved out of that tiny, tiny country, Judea, Palestine, across the Roman Empire and then beyond. And so what that means is that when we look at the Bible, when we look at this discipline of textual criticism, kind of reconstruct the original text, we have multiple sources in multiple languages. And what was preserved was the New Testament as we have it. So the earliest complete copy of the New Testament is in something called the Codex Sinaiticus, which is from around 325, between 3 and 325 AD. And that contains the New Testament as we have it today, with also a commentary called the Hermas Shepherd, which is at the end, but it also has the Old Testament. And then we have the records of the early church as they kind of grappled with not just transmitting the scriptures as they had originally come from the first century, but then other sources popping up and saying this should be in the Bible too. And that caused disputes. And those disputes are recorded. Often people think, oh, there's some kind of veil of secrecy over this, and a group of very powerful men got into a room together and just randomly decided. That isn't what happened. It was an organic process that was traced back to the original authors, through traditions and through a kind of rigorous process. And then in 393 AD, and then again in 395 AD, two councils of the church met to say we need to deal with these other sources that are trying to kind of get into the text and be accepted as original. And we need to say, actually, no, these are 2nd and 3rd century, or these were not written by the person they purport to have been written by. And we know that for the following reasons. So it was an open and rigorous process, recorded where there were disagreements. That was recorded as well. So, for example, there was a disagreement over whether the letter of James should be included. And in the end, the fact that James had been the bishop in Jerusalem and the Syrian church, which was right next to Jerusalem, had translated that letter and knew that it did originate from James. Their voice, the Syrian church's voice, was listened to in the process. So that's kind of how that happened.
Okay, thank you for that. Christian, maybe I can throw one your way. Even if we take what Amy has said tonight, if we can trust the Bible, we're going to come up against some things that are kind of uncomfortable for us to think about and process. Specifically in the Old Testament, you have seemingly God commanding his people to do things that we would never affirm today. I'm thinking specifically of coming into the promised land and some of the destruction and war that happens through that. Can you speak a little bit to that? What do you do with those passages? How do you still wrestle in thinking about those?
Well, thank you for that question. It is the question that occupied me very much for 4 years while I was doing my doctorate in Oxford. Precisely that question: how should we do it? How should we approach these texts today? And also, I wanted to know, what have Christians said about these texts for the last 2,000 years? Is this a problem that just occurred to us? Did they find it difficult? How did they wrestle with it? And I found it deeply fascinating. I've come away with a deeper love for the Bible and a deeper love for God at the end of my studies than I had at the beginning. So I found it not an easy journey, and there are certainly difficult questions, and I still don't think there's sort of a simple, easy answer that will just make all your problems go away. But I think the bottom line is, the more we wrestle with this, the deeper the insights are that we gain. So I think that's sort of the short summary of it. I think a very important historical observation is, because I looked at it from the 1st century onward, that it wasn't some sort of noble pagan philosophers or some people who were unaffected by Jesus who said, these problems are really difficult and you Christians deal with it. It was actually people who were impacted by Jesus, who were reading what he said about love of enemy, about this whole ethic of love, that it is at the core of the Christian life. They said, how do we make sense of these texts then? So it is actually a question that arose from within the church and didn't come from without. And so for 2,000 years, that happened in the 2nd century, Christians have known that this is a challenge, and they found actually not only one way, but at least 2 or 3 ways I found historically to basically address the question. And I think if I began to unpack all of them now, probably take very long. It took me 4 years to work on it. I'm still writing the book for it to be published soon. But so that's where I would begin with an answer.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And kind of along in the same lines with war, there's another question that typically comes up with God appearing to be sexist. Just a question of, how does the Bible treat women? How does the New Testament treat women? Is that, is it something we need to be concerned with? How would you address that question or begin to address that question?
Thank you. I love that question. I quite often get asked that question quite angrily because it's certainly true to say that the history of the church has not been very good on this issue. But in reality, Jesus of Nazareth was radically counter the culture that he was in, first century Jewish culture, in his approach to women. And even when we look at the Old Testament, often we read the translations in English that lend themselves to all sorts of misconceptions. For example, when Eve is created and the Bible describes her as Adam's helper, often I think the visual image probably that occurs to lots of us, it certainly occurs to me, is of a woman in an apron, do you call it an apron, with arms in the kitchen sink and bubbles up to it, up to here, and the idea of you're the helper. Actually, that Hebrew word translated helper is the word Ezer. And it's the word that God uses to describe himself in his relationship to human beings. It's a powerful word. When we come to the New Testament, what we see is far from being denigrating or derogatory towards or about women. Jesus is astonishing in his approach to women. He teaches women theology. He commends women who choose theology and learning and academia over housework in the story of Mary and Martha. He reveals great theological truths to women. There's a woman at the well who learns that Jesus is the Messiah. He says to her, I am he. There's another woman who's the recipient of one of the most powerful doctrinal statements of the New Testament that we wouldn't know if she had not heard it and recorded it. It's spoken at funerals often. You might be familiar with it. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, he will live. That's spoken to a woman called Martha. And then Jesus uses imagery about women that is not sort of patronizing to them. So in Luke 15, we have all sorts of images about what it means to come to know God, a famous story about the parable of the prodigal son, where God is a running father who runs out to greet his son. But just before that, God is described by Jesus as a woman who's lost a coin, and she's down on her hands and her knees in her house searching for that coin. In that story, you and I are the coin, and God is that woman. So he uses women positively in his teaching. There aren't sort of snide jokes about women. And then we see that women are also witnesses to the most important aspects of the Christian faith. If you think about it, the idea of the incarnation, the idea of God with us, is revealed first and foremost to a woman, Mary, Jesus' mother. The reality of God on the cross, the God who suffers for us and dies for us, the cross is primarily witnessed by women. It's the testimony of women that's recorded in the Gospels. There's only one man mentioned, and that's John in the narrative. All the other witnesses are women. And then the most important, if you like, after the incarnation, the cross, the resurrection, witnessed primarily the empty tomb by women. Now, in a culture where a woman's testimony in a court of law was worth less than a man, the idea that you would construct a religion based on the testimony of women is crazy, and yet that's what we see. And then in the early church, we see women prophesying, we see women playing all sorts of different roles, speaking publicly, operating as evangelists and teachers. And so my answer to that question would be that what I read in the Bible is not derogatory or negative about women. We may see that in the church, but that is not reflective of the Bible.
Thanks, Amy. We're going to open this up to live questions. If anybody had a question you didn't get to write down, you can come up to the microphone, and we're going to have someone guide you in asking that question. But before we do that, we got a question from the live stream. Amy, if you could speak to this. You talked a lot about getting into the text of the Bible. Someone asked, how should I read it in sequence, or should I just open it up, read any chapter at a time? How do you do that?
I think that's a great question, and it's helpful probably to think about how the Bible was originally written. So a gospel was written as a whole. So to begin at the beginning and to read it through is a really powerful thing. And it doesn't take as long as you would think. You could probably read a gospel in about 2.5 hours if you read regularly. My husband and I used to live in the inner city in London. We were involved in a church in London's most notorious neighbourhood for gun crime and gangs. And we did a lot of work with young people coming out of gangs. And I'll never forget a 13-year-old girl who had not been in school for 2 years. She already had a youth conviction for what's called GBH in Britain, grievous bodily harm, so serious violence against another person. And one of our youth workers was talking to her and felt sort of compelled to give her a gospel and gave her Mark's gospel. And this youth worker was telling me about it that evening, and I was thinking to myself, well, I'm sure that's not going to work. I mean, that kid hasn't been in school for 2 years and does not read for fun. I'm sure that's not going to be the approach with her. But the next day, she came onto the church site and shared that she'd begun to read Mark's gospel at the beginning, and she'd been unable to put it down. And she just found herself compelled and drawn to the person of Jesus as he'd walked off the pages of Scripture into her life. And she was fundamentally, dramatically transformed by that experience. And I've known university lecturers and company CEOs have a similar experience. So why not try reading a gospel in its entirety rather than just picking little pieces out randomly?
Great, thank you. Maybe this is a question both of you can speak to a little bit. Can you talk about the authors of the Old Testament? I know there's some more attestation of who wrote letters in the New Testament, but sometimes the Old Testament books are a little ambiguous. Who wrote the Old Testament? And this question specifically asks about Genesis.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I think sometimes we are tempted to give answers that the Bible itself doesn't give, and that does get us into trouble. So if we claim to know the answer to a question that is actually not answered in Scripture itself, we're on shaky ground. Sometimes we think, because traditionally that's what has been said about this or that part, say, of the Bible, that's the person who wrote it. If that's not actually what the text claims, at least for its entirety, then I think we're on shaky ground to claim that this is the case. And so therefore, there are certain books of the Bible where there's no indication who wrote it. There's some speculation, some of it ancient speculation, who wrote the historical books, for instance, or even in the case of the prophets, it's not clear that the prophets themselves wrote down the books that bear their names. Oftentimes we even hear of scribes who had the task of writing them down, who were their assistants. And so I think with respect to the book of Genesis, obviously, traditionally, the whole tradition of Genesis is associated with the name of Moses. But, and we speak about the 5 books of Moses, and that's appropriate in the text of, in terms of traditionally how the Christian church has received these books. But there are elements in those 5 books that describe Moses' own death. So already that suggests to us that probably it wasn't Moses who actually wrote this down. So I think what I'm saying is, if Scripture doesn't make a strong pronouncement on who did what, we probably should also be quite careful. We can put forward what we think is likely to be the case, but nothing hinges on it in terms of whether it's true or not. The question really is, did the Holy Spirit inspire it, and can we trust it? And I think if the answer to this is yes, it is secondary which human vessel or vessels were used to write it down. That's where I'd go with it.
Amy, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that scholarship has also shifted on this, hasn't it? Because there was a moment when people were saying, well, this can't be as old as it purports to be because writing didn't even exist in the Mesopotamian basin at this point. And then earlier and earlier indications outside of the biblical material have shown us that absolutely writing was flourishing at the time that these events purport to be from. And I think that is, in my experience, often the case when we examine, even with quite a skeptical perspective, these ancient texts. What we discover is that there's evidence for them even outside of them.
Great, thank you. And, as I'm looking at this line that isn't there for people to ask live questions, I've been told I need to be a bit more bold in asking you to come up and ask questions. So this is me being really bold. We'd love to have you come forward and ask some questions with us.
You got a line for me right there now.
Yeah, the live thing right there, the live mic. Joel, you want to kick us off?
First of all, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk and took some copious notes. Maybe if I can glean like 10% of what you said, I think I'll really benefit from it. Romans 1 talks about the universal state of people that left to ourselves, we actually suppress the truth in unrighteousness, Paul says. So it's as much about not wanting to believe as it is not knowing the truth. And then much less wanting to obey on top of that. You're asking the unbeliever ultimately to give up all they know and to really step out into this void, not just of intellectual assent, but also of real faith and trust in the person of Jesus. You think about C.S. Lewis, who describes his own conversion, where he came kicking and fighting into the light, as he put it. So what would you say to someone who says, the evidence might be there, I can see it, I can't accept it, I can't because I don't want to. What would you say to someone who's wrestling with that?
Thank you for that question. In my experience, there are multiple reasons why people aren't ready to make a step towards God or don't want to. And predominantly there are probably two categories of reasons behind that. One of those reasons might be intellectual. They just simply don't believe it's actually true. And therefore, there's no basis on which to take that step towards God because it's not real. In their mind, it would be a delusion. And I think if that's the situation you're in, I would encourage you to consider Christian faith on its own terms. Often we talk about faith in our culture as this idea of a leap into the dark. Actually, the New Testament word for faith, Christian idea of faith, is the Greek word pistis, which means to be persuaded. So faith, in a biblical sense, is not throw all your objections away and just take this leap into delusion and embrace unreality. It's to have been persuaded that this is actually true and to be drawn intellectually to believe it. And I think there's probably a whole second category of questions that I come up against or into contact with a lot, and those would be questions or objections that are based on experience. Either I can't believe this because of my experience of life or what's been done to me or what the church has done, or even some of the objections we're looking at tonight. And my encouragement to you, if that's the situation you're in, would be to hang on in there and to keep pursuing the possibility of God being real, the possibility of a loving God being real and being out there for you. And don't, or if you possibly can, don't layer over what Christians have said or done that have hurt you over who Jesus actually is. See if you could view him and meet him for yourself, not through a lens of what the church or other Christians may have said or done, but on his own terms. And a great way to do that is by reading a gospel for yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you again. I apologize if I get the terms incorrectly, but you mentioned earlier a scholar named Swinburne. who used Bayes' theory to show that the resurrection of Christ had a probability of 97%. Can you explain, walk through that? What's Bayes' theory? How does it work? And how did he use that to come to that conclusion?
Sure. Well, you can get the book. It's called The Resurrection of God Incarnate, isn't it? Not the Son. It's The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And you can read his study. So basically, Bayes' theorem is a probability theorem that is used actually in all sorts of different ways. It's used apparently in hedge funds. I don't know if we've got any hedge fund managers in the building tonight. I'd like to meet you afterwards if we have. But it's used day to day in that kind of way. And basically, he gave different aspects of historical evidence, different attributes within that theorem, and he works it all out and then draws this conclusion, which, you know, some people have torn apart. Other people have said, I don't accept the premise. I don't accept, you know, you giving this value to that piece of historical evidence. But really, what I think is interesting about that is that often people reject a biblical miracle out of hand because it's improbable, it's unlikely. But if someone who's really operating at that level as a philosopher has investigated it in that way, I think that ought at least to give us pause to look at it for ourselves and not just reject it out of hand. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Amy. Here's a question that came in on one of the cards. What are the historical accuracies in other Western religions? So, you know, Judaism, Islam, what about Eastern religions? I mean, can someone stand up and say the same thing about the Quran that you did tonight?
Do you want to speak to that, Christian? Or?
Yeah, I'm not, well, with respect to Judaism, of course, then, you know, Christianity inherited or shares what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, with the Jewish people. So there, the answers would be very similar with respect to those texts that we call the Old Testament. With respect to the Quran, I'm not really a Quranic scholar, so I feel I'd be skating on very thin ice if I tried to give a sort of a historical critique of it. So I think that's really a question that you need to ask a Quranic scholar. I mean, we have friends, obviously, that we work with who actually have researched some of the tradition of manuscripts of the Quran and so on. And I think my takeaway is that it's certainly not the case that the evidence is any stronger than it is in the case of Christianity. I mean, that's certainly not the case.
Mm-hmm. Having studied the Quran a bit at university, I think there are some major differences in comparison with the Bible. One is the claim of single authorship rather than multiple authorship, although that's a contested claim, obviously. I think the second is that in the Quran you read retellings of stories that are recorded elsewhere. So Muhammad had a good deal of interaction with the Jewish community and a little bit with the Christian community, and he retells stories, if we believe it is Muhammad, but they are retold in the Quran in slightly different forms. And so, for example, there's a retelling of the story of Joseph, you know, of the coat of many colours. You may have seen the musical. And in that story, a man called Haman, who is mentioned in the book of Esther in the Bible as a minister in a government in a totally different time period from the time of Joseph. But Muhammad conflates those two time periods and puts those two stories together. For that reason, the contemporary Jewish community in Medina rejected Muhammad, and that's a root cause of some of the antipathy between those two communities, actually, in the Middle East. And that's to do with a Jewish view, very high view of their Holy Scripture, and then saying, well, you can't come along hundreds of years later and say, actually, it happened like this, but with no historical evidence. So an Islamic scholar, I'm sure, would have a different interpretation of that, but at least in the retelling of biblical stories where different characters appear at different time periods, I think we are dealing with two very different types of literature.
Great, thanks. Let's open it back up to the floor.
Yes, I've heard a lot about the theory of the Q manuscripts as the answer to how how the Gospels might have been started and spread and preserved without any divine inspiration. Could you tell me a little bit more about what the theory says and how it fits into, or maybe doesn't fit into, the preservation of the Scriptures?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go first, or?
Don't mind.
Okay. So the theory of Q is that before the Synoptic Gospels were written down, there was an earlier historical source that doesn't exist anymore, that the Gospel writers were then able to draw on. And that's given as an explanation as to why sometimes the same stories are told across particularly the Synoptic Gospels. And lots of people still hold to the idea of Q, but I think given the earlier and earlier dating now of the four Gospels, there is a movement within scholarship to say we're not even sure that there was time for Q, and there may not have needed to have been a Q, and since it doesn't exist as far as we know, we're not sure. So in some ways it's a theoretical thing, but the idea is that it's a capturing of the eyewitness testimony that then the gospel writers were able to all draw on.
That's right. And so, I mean, as far as I can tell, in terms of whether the New Testament is trustworthy, the New Testament Gospels are trustworthy, whether it's accurately preserved or not, Q is neither here nor there. It's not an argument for or against. It simply tries to make sense of what we find. So the Synoptic Gospels that Amy referred to are the first three. Mark is, by common consent, probably written first, Matthew and Luke. And Q tries to explain what Matthew and Luke have in common but don't share with Mark. So it is that Mark, 90% of Mark is found in Matthew. And also a huge overlap, obviously, with Luke. But then there are certain things that you find in Matthew and Luke that you do not find in Mark. So essentially, the way you hypothesize to Q is to say, okay, whatever they share with Mark, perhaps they knew Mark. And actually, there's good reason that they might have known Mark. Actually, Luke tells us, I'm not the first one to draw up an account. Many have drawn up an account. I know these accounts, and now I'm giving you an orderly account. So Luke does not at all deny that he's aware of other sources and that other people have written sources and that he's aware of them. But obviously, he also had additional information. He felt it was very important to give an orderly account so people would know the trustworthiness of what they have come to believe. So that shows you a number of things, that people cared about what happened historically, whether it was trustworthy, that people went about it almost like in a scholarly way, comparing sources. So that actually heightens the understanding that what they were wanting to do was to be historically accurate and careful. And so what scholars then did, they compared the texts and they saw, okay, there are these bits that are in Matthew and in Luke, but not in Mark. So, and they're so similar, so either actually Matthew knew Luke or Luke knew Matthew, and those theories are still out there, held by smaller groups of scholars. But perhaps there was a third source, that Q is just short for German Quelle, meaning source, which basically most people think had very little storytelling in it, mostly the teachings of Jesus. So if Q existed, it's likely that something like Q could have existed because people take notes. You know, many of you took notes today. And so you have a Q for what Amy said, a quelle. And so if somebody collates this and writes it up and then you use it to teach Sunday school and to think about it again, so of course people would have taken note of what Jesus said. So there are lots of sources around. The question is, what did the evangelists use? So there's very strong evidence that Amy has laid out that it was based on eyewitness testimony, that the eyewitnesses are all over, that it's accurate in geography, accurate in terms of the naming, accurate in terms of many of the details, the way miracles are related, and all of these kind of things. But of course, they would have talked about it. So it's not surprising. So whether Q existed or not, a lot of scholars now begin to doubt it again, that it existed. Others remain firmly committed to it. But in terms of can we trust the New Testament records, it has no bearing. So if Q existed and what Matthew and Luke drew from Q, if they did indeed draw on Q, in addition to other sources, we just have good reason to believe that it was accurate. And it actually reflected what Jesus had actually said. So in terms of, does it threaten our faith? Not at all. Should we believe it? Join the club of scholars and form your own opinion. And if you have a good argument, publish it, and you'll get famous. So
That's what we all want, to be famous.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Hey, Amy, thank you so much. That was really great. I have sort of an evangelism question, and in a nutshell, it's how important should biblical reliability or inerrancy be to the seeker or the evangelist talking to a seeker and assessing whether Christianity is true? So suppose you come across someone, or you are that someone, who is just convinced that the Bible has some error or there's some contradiction, and it's unlikely that you're going to come out thinking that that's going to be a result. How should that affect your evaluation of Christianity?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think sometimes people in the church make the mistake of saying the Bible is this sort of holy, religious level book, and in order to be a Christian, you have to jump over this huge hurdle of accepting every single thing, even that which you haven't read and don't understand, and then you can be a Christian. And actually, that's a mistake. The Gospels were written as witnesses, historical witnesses, and they were written to be discussed, scrutinized, read by people who didn't believe and who had every predisposition to disbelieve. And so one of the things that I'm passionate about, that I would love us to do in our generation, is to recapture that vision of these as historically reliable, credible witnesses. Even if you're not going to accept every single word, that doesn't matter. You can still read them on their own terms, which is as witnesses, and to not be put off by the kind of the other things that the church might layer onto it, and to begin to see whether through reading that gospel, is there truth to this? Is there reality to this? Is it possible that what Jesus claimed, that coming to know him would be like being literally born all over again? Is there truth to that statement? I don't know how many people in this room have been through childbirth, but has it ever struck you that that is an extraordinary image for a first century single man to choose to describe what it's like to come to know God? When I had twins, I was 29. My husband and I had been married for 8 years, and I was the size of a London bus by the end of that pregnancy. And we went into hospital, and, birth is gruesome. It's gruesome. There's blood on the floor. It's this gigantic struggle. It's incredibly physical. And out of that experience, 2 new human beings emerged. We went from being 2 carefree young adults to a family of 4 with a people carrier, a proper grown-up car with sliding doors. It was quite shocking. But it was undeniable that something real had happened. I didn't expect to go to parties and for people to say, well, I question the reality of Zach and JJ, my boys. I question the reality of the experience you've been through, because I was gigantic. I then did get back to a reasonably normal size, and there are now 2 people in the world as a result of that experience. That is the image Jesus Christ chose to use to describe what it means to come to know God. Not some airy-fairy sort of mist, not rainbows in the sky, birth. I think that's pretty awesome. We can discover that for ourselves, whether there's reality to what Jesus says. We can interrogate the historicity of these sources, but we can interrogate the reality of them by making that personal response to him. And that is just a prayer away. God is just a prayer away from all of us. He promises that if we will reach out to him, he will answer.
Thank you. Well, my wife's about to give birth in 3 weeks, so
It's gruesome.
thanks for that.
Yeah.
I don't think she's listening right now, so that's good. Let's keep going.
Thank you again so much for coming and just sharing all of your knowledge with us. On the note of sort of the evangelism, someone who just wants to become a little bit more equipped, digest a little more, what are your personal favorites of extra resources, whether it be sermons or books or papers, that you would recommend going out of this to just continue reading up that we would look into?
Well, thank you. That is an amazing setup to promote the RZIM website. And the amazing thing is that, did you notice I did say Z there? I'm being very culturally connected. It's actually Z, but rzim.org or rzim.eu has other content as well. And really there you can find all sorts of resources looking into these important questions about Christian faith and whether there are actually answers to them.
Great. I don't think she gets a kickback for that answer.
No.
So she wasn't planted. All right, go ahead.
Hello. Again, thank you for fielding all these questions and all that you've spoken about so far. My question is, you spoke a bit about biblical canon prior to this, and one question I have, having read about it a bit ago, is that I'd say like the most questioned document that's currently included in the biblical canon is the book of Revelation, and I've heard even in like somewhat more recent times some obligations to having it, some rather kind of contentions to it being included there. I just wanted to hear what you would have to say about its validity, because I suppose one main criticism of it is that it's more of a vague document, and it comes through almost as somewhat of a dream. And unlike the Gospels, which you talked about, which are based in historical things that occurred, this isn't actually, similar to that in that way. So what would you have to say about Revelation?
Thank you. When it comes to questions about the canon, about the inclusion of something in Scripture, there were a number of questions that needed to be settled. The most important was authorship. Was this actually written by who it claimed to have been written by? And could we know that? Could we scrutinize that process of transmission? And that was never in question with the book of Revelation. There was clarity that John had written it. The questions were about, as you said, the content. And the nature of this literature is apocalyptic. It's incredibly visual and prophetic. And it's amazing literature to read, but also can be quite disturbing. And I think on that basis, some people questioned it. But I mean, it was pretty universally accepted as scriptural, and on the basis that John had written it, accepted from right at the beginning, pretty much. Would you?
Yeah, I think we should accept it and embrace it, and we should be very careful how we interpret it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Hi, thanks again for speaking. So I'm taking a class currently on the Gospel of Matthew, and I'm just sort of curious. Each one of the Gospel writers was writing in a different context to a different community. And so Matthew, it seems, was really writing to a very Jewish community that was also trying to bring in Gentiles. And so he really focuses on the Jewish nature of Jesus. But so each one of the Gospel writers has kind of a different audience. How much do you think this affected their writing, and does this matter in what they might have been writing about in the Gospels?
Thank you. I think it's great. For me, it's a massive attraction of the biblical narrative that we know who wrote and that we have different sources, we have different voices writing. And so you have Luke beginning his gospel saying, I'm a Gentile. I was not personally there for any of this, but I've come to know Jesus personally, and I want other people who are also Gentiles, who will never have had that first-hand direct experience of Jesus in the first century doing a miracle, to be able to trust the source about him. So that's Luke's perspective as he's writing. And then you have John giving us his perspective about why he wrote. He says in chapter 21, many have undertaken to write an account of these things. And he goes on to say, all the books in the world couldn't contain the stories that we could say, but these things are written that you may know and that you may have life in his name. So there you have the beloved disciple, the one who laid his head on Jesus' chest, giving us his perspective on what we need to know to experience that life that Jesus promised. And to me, there's a sort of pre-postmodernism, amazing acknowledgement of the perspective I'm bringing to this material, and I'm going to lay it out on the table for you. I think that's really powerful, and it's really interesting, and it lends itself to all sorts of people from different cultures and different experiences reading this, and it's a much richer experience. How are we doing for time?
Just a couple more minutes, yeah.
It is refreshing to hear a logically consistent defense of belief in the Bible. So thank you so much. As a philosophy student, undergrad, like over half my classes I encounter skepticism. So this has been awesome. But I want to change the tenor of the conversation just a tad to kind of personal, if you don't mind. What is your favorite parable from the Lord Jesus Christ and why?
Good question.
I'm not going to go. I'll give you something else. It's not a parable, but it's an encounter that Jesus had that pops to mind immediately, and it is very early on in the Gospels. Very early on, for instance, in the Gospel of Mark, there is a man who has leprosy and who throws himself before Jesus. And in doing so, he takes incredible risks because leprosy was not only a physical and medical condition, but was also religious, cultic. It made him unclean. He had to shout, "Unclean, unclean." He had to warn people off. So he was excluded from society. He was lonely. He was isolated. His identity was unclean, unclean. That's who he was to the core of his being. Feeling unworthy and being excluded from the religious life of Israel, from the society of Israel. And so he somehow plucks up the courage and thinks, maybe there is hope for me. Maybe, just maybe, I don't always have to feel that way inside and live that way. And he takes the complete risk, runs to Jesus, breaking all these laws, offending people, and throws himself at Jesus' mercy, falling down before Jesus, and then looks to Jesus and says, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." And in that if, all his hopes, all the risk he was taking is expressed. Because if Jesus says, "No, you're unclean, you've broken these rules, I reject you, how dare you, go back to your colony," he would have fallen much deeper. See, sometimes we don't even dare to hope because we fear that our hopes will be dashed. And he looks, and what he sees in Jesus' eyes when he makes eye contact is something that must have so profoundly touched this man. And then what does Jesus do? Even before he speaks, he reaches out and touches him right here. And that man probably hadn't been touched by anyone from healthy society for years, maybe decades. Can you imagine the thirst, the hunger for acceptance, for love, for being embraced? He looks at Jesus, Jesus touches him, and then he says, "I am willing, be clean." And why is that a favorite thing for me? Because I identify with that man. I know, I feel, sometimes there's this, just inadequacies and sinfulness and things that, where I worry, is this, what makes me lovable and worthy of acceptance? All these kind of identity questions that I can relate to throughout my life. And when I come to encounter Jesus, invariably, I find his eyes looking at me lovingly, his hand reaching out, breaking through the barrier of sin and alienation and uncleanness, and embracing me and saying, "I am willing, be clean." So in that little encounter, it's just 2 or 3 verses in the Gospels, all that makes Jesus so attractive and beautiful, and why I love him so much and go around the world inviting people to explore him and get to know him. By reading the scriptures, by praying, it's all in there. So I love that little encounter. So that would be my answer.
That's good. Mine is really short, you'll be glad to know. It's the parable of Jesus saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy, he went, sold all he had, and bought that field. That's the image Jesus chooses to describe what it is to discover God and his love for us, the potential of knowing him, that it's totally joyful, that it's overwhelmingly exciting and wonderful, and it's worth giving everything you ever have owned, have the potential to own, in order to have that one thing, that relationship with God.
Well, I think we'll use that as our last question. It seems like a good fitting note to end on. Sorry for any other questions that are lingering. I know I encouraged you all to get in line, so then you got to push you away. Let's before we close tonight, let's give Amy and Christian another round of applause. Thank you guys for being with us. Thank you for your answers and your encouragement. I know you guys will be floating around for a few minutes to maybe catch some other questions. As we close tonight, let me just say this. There's a couple things I want to let you know about for follow-up. I'd encourage you to check out festivalofthought.buzz if you want to know what else is going on with the Festival of Thought this week in the Loop or on some of the other university campuses. Festivalofthought.buzz. You can see the schedule and speakers. Specifically, I want to point out Friday night we're having a concert and a showcase for Christian art and artists there at the Harvest Cathedral here in Chicago. So we'd love to invite you to come out, check that out. Again, you can find it on the website. The other thing is if you're here and you've still got questions, you still are exploring who this Jesus person is or what it means to be a follower of Jesus or what this Christianity thing is all about, I'd encourage you to examine the Alpha course that we have available. And that's going to be offered in the next couple weeks as an immediate follow-up to the Festival of Thought. This is a place where you can come with other people who are in a similar spiritual state, just examining and having questions about Jesus. You'll have a meal, you'll do a talk, and then break out into small groups to continue talking about those questions for a couple weeks. So there's more information about all that stuff right outside. Thank you guys. Thank you for joining us online on the live stream, and thank you for coming out tonight.